Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Simone Lässig, and I'm the director of the German Historical Institute, Washington. It is my great pleasure today to welcome you all to our panel discussion, Competing Memories, International Debates about Remembering the Holocaust and Colonialism. The day-to-day work of the DHI centers on research and on scholarly exchange. But we also make time for public outreach. Several times a year, we organize lectures, symposia, and discussion programs that provide an opportunity for professional historians to engage with a non-specialist audience on new directions in historical research and on current debates about the bearing of the past on the present. And today's panel discussion falls into the second category. The Nazi era and the Holocaust, I need hardly say, have a central place in the memory culture of contemporary Germany. 3/4 of a century after the end of World War II, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, roughly translated, coming to terms with the past, remains an ongoing process and a subject of debate and even controversy. To be sure, it is no longer controversial to say that under Nazi rule, Germany launched a war of conquest and annihilation. It is not controversial to say that Germany carried out systematic mass murder and other crimes against humanity. And it is not controversial to say that as it recedes further into the past, the Nazi era still imposes responsibilities on Germans and Germany. These general principles, I would say, are not sources of controversy. Controversy can and does arise rather on the particulars of how Nazi rule and the Holocaust are remembered and explained, on the question how the responsibilities imposed by the past have changed over time. And such a controversy broke out this summer following the publication of a German translation of the book Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization by Michael Rothberg, and a provocative essay entitled The German Catechism by Dirk Moses. In brief, the controversy centered on the question of how far the history of European colonialism and decolonization figures in the history of the Holocaust and German responses to it. That controversy is the subject of our panel discussion today. Our intention, I want to stress, is not to reenact the debate or to weigh the arguments the participants put forward. We want to take a step back or aside and consider what the debate prompted by Rothberg's book and Moses' essay might indicate about German memory culture today and what the differing receptions those works received in Germany, the United States, and Great Britain might mean for the future of transatlantic dialogue in the field of German history. The discussion will be moderated by Rita Chin and Akasemi Newsome, and they will also introduce our panelists. Let me introduce our moderators. Rita Chin is a professor of modern European history at the University of Michigan and a vice president of the American Historical Association. Her research has focused on migration and immigration in Europe and the history of European colonialism and decolonization. Akasemi Newsome is the Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies and the Associate Director of Research at the Global International Area Studies Hub, both at the University of California, Berkeley. Her work explores the intersection of migration, labor, and social movements. Rita and Akasemi, thank you very much for being here today and for agreeing to serve as the moderators of our program. Let me add a quick word of thanks to the American Historical Association and its German counterpart, the Verband der Historiker und Historikerinnen Deutschlands, the co-sponsors of today's program, and to my co-organizers, Akasemi Newsome, Lutz Raphael, the chairperson of the German Historians Association, and Isabel Richter, the DAAD professor of history and German at the University of California, Berkeley. Special thanks goes to Heike Friedman, the program officer at the DHI's Pacific Regional Office in Berkeley, who once more did a magnificent job in handling the arrangements and the communication for this panel discussion. And together with Isabel and Akasemi, the lecture series on memory cultures that will follow next semester. And finally, I want to thank all our panelists and all of you in the audience for joining us today. So I now turn the moderation over to Rita and Akasemi. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Simona, for that kind introduction and warm welcome to us all. As mentioned, my name is Akasemi Newsome, and I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies at UC Berkeley, as well as Associate Director of Research at the Global International and Area Studies Hub at UC Berkeley. Without further ado, let's turn to our panelists for this scholarly event, Competing Memories, International Debates about Remembering the Holocaust and Colonialism. In alphabetical order, our first panelist is Frank Biess. He is professor of history at the University of California, San Diego, and has published widely on the political, social, and cultural history of Germany in the 20th century. The German version of his most recent book, Republik der Angst, eine andere Geschichte der Bundesrepublik, from 2019, was a finalist for the Nonfiction Award of the Leipzig Book Fair. The English version, German Angst, Fear and Democracy in the Federal Republic of Germany, coming out in 2020, received the 2021 Norris and Carol Hundley Award from the Pacific Branch of the American Historical Society for the most distinguished book in any category. He's currently working on a new project on the global history of the interwar Weimar Republic. Our next panelist, Robert Heinze, is a research fellow at the German Historical Institute, Paris. He is working on a history of urban transport in Africa using 4 case studies: Bamako, Kinshasa, Lusaka, Nairobi. Before embarking on this postdoctoral research at the University of Trier, he completed his PhD in 2012 at the University of Constance on the history of radio in Namibia and Zambia, with a focus on decolonization periods, anti-colonial resistance, and post-colonial nation building. He's interested in exploring infrastructures in post-colonial societies through a lens of historical materialism, analyzing them both as material technologies and in their interactions with political economies and urban societies. Our next panelist, Professor Esra Ozyurek, is Sultan Qaboos Professor in Abrahamic Faiths and Shared Values at the Faculty of Divinity in the University of Cambridge. She received her PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And Professor Ozyurek is an anthropologist who seeks to understand the tension between politics, memory, and religion in Turkey and in Europe. She's the author of Being German, Becoming Muslim, Race, Religion, and Conversion in the New Europe, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2014, and Nostalgia for the Modern, State, Secularism, and Everyday Politics in Turkey, which came out with Duke University Press in 2007. Her newest manuscript, Shouldering the Guilt, Embracing Empathy, Holocaust Memory and Muslim Belonging in Post-War Germany, is currently under review with Stanford University Press. Our final panelist, Professor Stefanie Schüler-Springorum, is Director for the Center of Research on Antisemitism at Technical University of Berlin. Her previous roles include Director for the Institute of the History of German Jews in Hamburg and Chair of the Leo Baeck Institute's Academic Working Group in Germany. Professor Schüler-Springorum's work focuses on German Jewish history, and Spanish history in the 19th and 20th centuries, and is characterized by a gender perspective. She's the author of Die Jüdische Minderheit in Königsberg, 1871 to 1945, which came out in 1996, Krieg und Fliegen, Die Legion Condor im Spanischen Bürgerkrieg, which came out in 2010 with a Spanish translation in 2014, and Perspektiven deutsch-jüdischer Geschichte, Geschlecht und Differenz, which came out in 2014, that will come out in English in 2022. A warm welcome to our illustrious panelists. And at this point, I'll turn the baton over to Rita to start with questions.
Thanks, Akasemi. As a way to get the discussion started, we wanted to ask each panelist to address how you understand the so-called second Historikerstreit, that is the controversy catalyzed by the German translation of Michael Rothberg's Multidirectional Memory and Dirk Moses's essay, The German Catechism, and its relation to German memory culture around the Holocaust and German colonialism. So we would like it if each of you could tell us a bit about how you see these things relating to each other. Perhaps we'll start with you, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Rita, and thank you to all the organizers for their initiative in making this event possible and in inviting me to participate. I have followed this debate from the distinct subject position of a historian who grew up in Germany, but has now also lived and worked in American academia for 30 years. The project of Holocaust memory, as it emerged in the 1980s, was extremely important for me and is one of the reasons why I became a historian of Germany in the first place. In my student days, I was a fierce partisan of Team Habermas and the singularity thesis in the first Historikerstreit. But as Bob Dylan said, the times they are a-changing. And some of the debate also reveals, I think, a rather conservative response to a relentlessly changing, more globalized and less Eurocentric world. I think Sebastian Conrad has recently argued along these lines. I also think that the debate has been too fixated on the back and forth in the feuilletons and has not paid sufficient attention to the actual scholarly contributions of the main protagonists, so Michael Rothberg's book, Multidirectional Memory, and Dirk Moses' book, The Problems of Genocide. Both books seek to place the history of the Holocaust in new contexts. This by itself is not inherently apologetic, as it has been claimed, but constitutes a central analytic operation by which we arrive at new insights in our discipline. I do not have time to outline the contributions of these books, but I was very frustrated, perplexed, at times even dismayed by what I saw as defensive, anxiety-ridden, sometimes also highly polemical response to these interventions, mainly, though not exclusively, in Germany. The arguments of these books were so distorted that they became hardly recognizable. For example, by portraying an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. The German criticism of Rothberg's book also targeted American academia more generally. According to German critics like Thomas Schmidt, we are supposedly in the grip of post-colonial anti-Semitic activists who place morality above scholarship. This, of course, is a caricature of American academia. It also stands in a long tradition of German conservative anxieties about threatening and subversive American influences. Some of the German criticism, I think, derived from the understandable anxiety that the battle over Holocaust memory has in fact not been won, that we are still or again fighting the battles of the 1980s. So any effort at deviating from established interpretations quickly appears as yet another attempt at minimizing and relativizing. There is also an important generational dimension to this reaction, but I think Stefanie will talk about this, so I will leave this out for now. So while I can understand this reaction, I find the related accusations of anti-Semitism and Holocaust revisionism deeply troubling. These accusations are supposed to shut down debate, to defend the scholarly status quo, to avoid a serious intellectual engagement. For nothing is more toxic in our field than being labeled an anti-Semitic Holocaust minimizer, especially if this charge is deployed by influential senior academic men. Much of the critical reaction focused on the defense of the singularity thesis. This thesis, it has to be said, is largely a peculiarity of German academia. In my department of about 40 historians, most of my colleagues would have trouble even understanding the notion that any historical event could claim some sort of world historical singularity. There is some evidence that this notion also served as a screen memory that made it more difficult to recognize other forms of past and contemporary racism, though I think we simply need more research here. In general, I do not understand the tendency to label open-ended research questions about the relationship between colonialism and the Holocaust as somehow inherently dangerous. If you're curious about the productive potential of these analogies, just read W.E.B. Du Bois' moving account of his visit to the memorial of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1949 that Rothberg discusses in his book. True, this research might indeed lead to a new understanding of the Holocaust or to a different commemorative culture. But it does not necessarily diminish the Holocaust. On the contrary, it might actually reaffirm its historical specificity, underline its global significance, and secure its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. Interestingly, the more than 90-year-old Jürgen Habermas appeared to be more intellectually flexible than some of his German compatriots. In a very nuanced contribution, he made clear that, quote, the political self-understanding of the citizens of a nation state cannot be frozen in time, and that members of other cultures need to recognize their own heritage and their own history of suffering in our political culture. Like all academic works, Rothberg's and Moses's books are not perfect and certainly invite controversial debate. But these books strike me as innovative and original contributions to a necessary, desirable, and perhaps inevitable unfreezing of contemporary Holocaust debates. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Robert?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for organizing this this debate, and thank you for inviting me. I think, like Frank, I can maybe start a little biographically. I came to political age basically by the end of the 1990s, and my first election was the election of the red and green government, and the debates around especially the Holocaust memorial were kind of important to me at the time, as well as the experience of voting for a pacifist party that then basically started a war in the Kosovo or the first engagement of the German army after 1945 with our then foreign minister Josef Fischer claiming that because of Auschwitz we need to do this. And I think that kind of marks a turning point in the way that the Holocaust has been developed in the self-understanding of German society and the German state. And I think I want to. I've also been kind of a participant in the debates, both in the kind of prehistory of the current debate, which was the debate around Achille Mbembe in 2020, and in the current debate. And I think a historicization of this debate is what is needed in order for us to productively go forward. And I've always had problems with this framing of the debate as a second Historikerstreit, because it kind of marks these 2 points. There was the Historikerstreit in the 1980s, and then we have this debate that happens now. And all the things that happened in between or happened even before the Historikerstreit are kind of put to the side. So if we kind of situate the current debate in the context of a longer process of how German society, through the struggle of many activists and historians, slowly developed an understanding of the Holocaust and its own role in it, and individual Germans' role in it. And that's something that's still ongoing if you look at the local level in Germany, at the Stolpersteine initiatives, or at local debates around small concentration camps and how they are to be memorialized. So I think this is a context that is still important. I want to specifically point out 2 points on that line. The one is the debate about the forgotten victims in the mid-1980s that happened a little bit after the Historikerstreit and then went on in the 1990s. And I think that's interesting because a lot of the arguments that I found in the current debate around the competition of victims, the Opferkonkurrenz, and the question of whether the focus on Jewish victims of the Holocaust blocked the remembrance, the memorialization of other victims, but also very concretely restitution for other victims, were already made in that context. And the second point is, as I already mentioned, the debate around the Holocaust Memorial, because I think in the debate around the Holocaust Memorial, this question of the singularity plays a very specific role. And there is a third position that I find really interesting, and that is a left-wing position that takes from the Historikerstreit the singularity thesis and defends it against the right, but at the same time argues against the Holocaust Memorial because it says that there's a danger that in the Holocaust Memorial, this can lead to a kind of Schlussstrich that is more effective even than the one that had been demanded by the right in the previous debates. So if we make the singularity thesis this kind of official thing that is embodied in the Holocaust Memorial in our new capital in Berlin, that might close the debate in ways that we don't want. And that's also a kind of an anti-national position, which I think is interesting for the debate today, because it seems to me that the positions in the debate today are both positions that argue for a certain kind of national self-understanding that needs to be done at the national level. So it's either Germany situates itself in a kind of a global discourse, but that's also a kind of new place for the German nation, or it's the kind of, no, Germany has this very specific history, and even maybe the world can learn from this this way of dealing with the past, but it's both about the German nation. And the third position that I mentioned in the Holocaust Memorial is one that has used the singularity thesis in order to criticize the German state and to criticize German society as a post-fascist society, and it's one that has continuities to Nazism, and it's one that is still ongoing if you look at debates around racist violence in Germany today. Now, on the question of the historical connections between colonial violence and the Holocaust, now I'm taking my hat as a historian of Africa. I'm interested in how colonialism is modeled in this debate, because from the perspective of African history, this kind of modeling of colonialism as a total thing, as a colonial situation, has been questioned in the last 20 years or so from a lot of vantage points. So most Africanists now understand the colonial state as a relatively weak state, which doesn't mean it can't be a violent state. If you look at, for example, Jean-François Bayard's notion of the colonial moment, he very much questions this totality of the colonial situation and argues for colonialism as a complex event, a story of synchronic and diachronic interactions, and a contingent thing. And this focus on colonial violence is something that seems to decontextualize it sometimes. And the same can be said about the Holocaust, because the question becomes, if you look at mass violence in the Second World War more broadly in the occupation of Eastern Europe and so on, what's going on in the Holocaust in the context of that, the actions against partisans, the hunger politics in Belarus or in the Ukraine, and so on. You can find a lot of connections to colonial violence, but they are limited to relatively specific elements that play out very differently in different scenarios. And so I think it's necessary to center the diversity and specificity of historical and geographical contexts if we want to go further. And then the comparison between colonial violence and the Holocaust doesn't become an unusual thing, is my impression, at least from the literature. But also it's very concrete and very complex in a way. And so I want to make a last point that brings these two viewpoints together. I've argued elsewhere that at the heart of the current debate is not the relationship between colonialism and the Holocaust, but the entanglement of post-fascism and post-colonialism in German society after 1945. And that pertains to many elements. There are a lot of personal and institutional continuities, not just of Nazi remnants in the Bundesrepublik, but also colonial remnants. There are actually efforts to regain the German colonies that were lost in the First World War. There's a colonial nostalgia in German society, as my colleague Stefanie Michels, for example, has pointed out. And I think the main interesting point for us in the current debate is to compare how Germany dealt with Jewish victims of the Holocaust and how it dealt with other victims, both of the Holocaust, or the Porajmos, for example, and the murder of Sinti and Roma, and of colonial violence. Useful to look at the history of contemporary Germany, of the way that it dealt with memory and the way that it dealt with the victims of both colonial violence and the Holocaust, in order to gain a greater understanding of what is at stake in the current debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Esra?
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm the anthropologist, not the historian in this group. Yeah, maybe if I can also say a couple of words about how I came of age politically and why I came to this topic. I was born and grew up in Turkey, and as I was coming of age in late 1980s, early 1990s, being an anti-Semite was being leftist and being anti-fascist. You know, it was as simply as that. And then also in the early 1990s, as people started to talk about the Armenian genocide, learning from the German experience was very important to us, you know, who found that an important political project. So I came to Germany, I guess, kind of ready to be impressed and to learn, but quickly my impressions, parts of them, turned into disappointment as I have realized how Holocaust memory has not succeeded at all in including minorities into it. And also more painfully observing how fight against anti-Semitism has become a tool of racism. You know, so these were shocking realities for me. And, you know, I had come to Germany to work on another project, but I just, you know, couldn't stop myself to following the twin discourses of Muslim anti-Semitism and also Holocaust memory, or how Holocaust memory cannot reach Muslims because they're not empathetic towards its Jewish victims. So these are the two stories that I have followed in the last 15 years. And I would say this thing that we are talking about today has not started a couple of years ago. I would say it started in the early 2000s. It is about, maybe the first Historikerstreit was about how will Germany define itself, its position in the enlarged Europe. But this is about how Germany maybe will position itself in relation to the world, both to Africa, for sure, but also to the Middle East, to Israel, Palestine. You know, so that is an important part. But I think even a more important part in this debate is how is Germany going to deal with its increasing diversity, that, you know, since 2000s that people have been citizens, and now fourth of Germany is, you know, has background elsewhere. So I would say, you know, this is what has started it. And if we look at it from the twin discourse of anti-Semitism, we see this interesting parallel, but yet a little bit different discourse. The same people who have arguing that Holocaust is unique, it is not comparable to you know, any other crime, the exact same people make the argument that anti-Semitism, which has caused the Holocaust, is something that is shared by more and more people, that actually it is no longer even a German problem so much, but it is a problem that belongs to Muslims, also to, you know, Black people, to minorities, or these what was the phrase you were just, you know, the leftists in the American academia. So you know, so on the one hand they are trying to claim the Holocaust just belongs to us, but anti-Semitism now belongs to other people. And also Holocaust is something that happened in the past, and the anti-Semitism is in the present. And that's, you know, because we have learned from the Holocaust, now it is our turn to educate others, to teach others, to civilize others, so to speak. So it is this tension that I have been looking at. And this kind of anxiety that Frank was talking about, this hurt, this extreme pain of being accused of being an anti-Semite, that we know, more people that we know are under this threat, you know, who knows, including ourselves too, you know, it really is growing and growing and growing, has been felt since early 2000s among Muslim anti-racist activists. This is a very strong feeling that people have shared. People have defined themselves as fighting against anti-Semitism, and they were repeatedly being accused of anti-Semitic. Their funding was being cut off. You know, they were left into kind of social death, so to speak, that you couldn't occupy any space in public, you couldn't get funding, whatnot. So what we are seeing is that this accusation is expanding and is now directed against, lots of other minorities, lots of women, lots of white liberals, to people who are claiming or, alliance or even showing any sympathy towards minorities, towards Muslims, can be towards the Palestinian cause, but not even. So this is obviously not unique to Germany. We have in this thing about Islamogauchism in France that is happening, or another context, Turkey, it is the same thing. The government is trying to break any alliances between, let's say, Turks and Kurds. If you're a Turk, if you show any alliance towards Kurds, then it is not so different in parallel processes that you are alienated, pushed out of the discourse. So I feel like looking at including the Muslim question, the Middle East conflict, and the current diversity in Germany into that discussion is crucial. I feel like if we look at it only as the Holocaust and colonialism and only about two past guilts, it doesn't give the full picture that we need to include today the Middle East, the Muslim question into it.
Thank you, Esra. Stefanie.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. So as the last speaker, I have the big advantage that I can agree to all my colleagues and keep my statement to the 3 minutes that we were supposed to speak. And I will concentrate on what Frank already mentioned, which is the generational problem, so to speak. Not the problem, but the generational aspect. And Frank, you also mentioned your distinct subject position. So my distinct subject position is that of someone who is a colleague to most of those who are debating and are fighting, which is also a very specific situation, as you can imagine. But and I think in order to make clear what I understand by generational aspect, I think we really have to be, or to wheel back time and to be very clear, at least that's my opinion, that what we now call the German memory culture, or the famous Vergangenheitsbewältigung, is a very young and recent phenomenon. And I would also put it, as Esra said, at the beginning of the 2000s, when it became monolithic and political and part of the, of German political narrative and discourse vis-a-vis the world. But before that, it was extremely contested. And I want to give you one personal anecdote and then one example. The personal anecdote is from the end of the 1980s, when I was writing my PhD on the Jews in Königsberg, from the Kaiserreich to 45, and one of my supervisors, one of the most famous German historians on the Holocaust, he said, "No, I don't think you should include the Nazi time because you only have Jewish sources, so that's nothing new. So just skip it." So that was the late 1980s. So of course, in the 80s, we do have also some grassroots movements coming from the Geschichtswerkstätten, the history workshop movement, but it was far from what we are having now. And one more, just to get you into the feeling of the time of the 1990s, after unification, the debate on the exposition on the German army was in 96, and it was a nationwide protest on the street against this exhibition, which showed ordinary German soldiers as murderers. So, it is a very contested space. And again, in the 1990s, something we keep forgetting is there was a lot of debate on how to reconfigure the memorial sites in East Germany, like Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, who were also Stalinist camps after 45. And we have this conflation of Stalinist crimes and Nazi crimes, and the debate on this, and it's still ongoing on the European level. We do have the 23rd of August as the commemoration day for the victims of Stalinism. So this is a debate that is going on, and now I'm coming to the generation, this generation, which is slightly older than me, but only slightly, that were fighting these fights and that were moving these things, that were like the protagonists of this, what later would become the monolithic memorial culture. We're doing it very, fighting against, so to speak, to put it very simple, against the old right in the sense of the old Nazis or their followers, or even some of their Doktorväter in the historical departments, etc., and on a new phenomenon that would equate Stalinism and Nazism that came after 1990. So this feeling of fighting the good fight, is very much part of their life project. And I think this, again, German memorial culture is like what they were working for and fighting for. So in a way, I think we have to take this into account when we are as surprised, frustrated, and Frank, I absolutely agree, and shocked on the course of the debate. And but I think it's a life project on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think there is a serious, and I think the serious worry and concern on part of some of them at least, that those who have lived the 50s and 60s know how fragile all this is. So with the upsurge of the AfD and other populist right-wing radicalism, there is a serious fear that what has been gained can be lost again. And I think at least this fear we should really take serious. Having said all this, I absolutely agree with Esra that we cannot understand this debate without understanding the debate on anti-Semitism, on the BDS resolution, on Mbembe, etc., etc. And it is interconnected. And I'm not so sure in how far our colleagues from the history departments are aware and how far these are really interconnected, because it's the same people on social media who try to use this debate in order for a general attack on post-colonialism, and so on and so forth. So there's like the feuilleton debate and the historians debate, which are different debates, and I think we should separate them. But what connects them, and this is like my last and very pathetic end, is on the one hand, a really surprising lack of knowledge on both sides, sometimes a lack of curiosity, of academic curiosity, and I must say that's a pathetic part of empathy. I mean, sometimes when you listen to these debates, you really wonder, did you ever read a book on this or that topic, or did you ever read a novel? Toni Morrison, whatever. I mean, this is really what is striking me, and I think that's the way how we have to get out of this. First of all, to separate the feuilleton from the historians, and second, to get into a debate on, which is infused by empathy and knowledge, by both. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanie. So some of the things that I'm hearing as kind of common threads through all of your comments are around what Robert talked about as historicizing this set of discussions and debates, right? So understanding the sort of longer trajectory and the kind of context in which these moments of bubbling up occur, right? That they're not just individual discussions or debates sort of frozen as a first Historikerstreit or a second Historikerstreit, but that they have to be understood kind of as a whole. Akasemi, do you have thoughts here too?
I think this, the comments by the panelists illuminated how complex this current debate is, the need to really broaden kind of the time frame that we're thinking about. So it's not a recent sort of controversy, but really thinking about 2000 as when these debates kicked off in earnest, dovetailing with the opening and broadening of citizenship access in Germany. And I think a sort of pointed question I would want to put to the panel that maybe Stefanie could take the lead on answering, in your view, does this, for lack of a better term, second Historikerstreit invoke a vision of a racially homogeneous national community that has a flat and uniform relationship to the Nazi past? Because I think there's something to your insights about generational divides, but I'm wondering if that is shared by different generations engaging in this debate, namely a vision of a racially homogeneous German national community.
I think it has to do with it. And I mean, Esra said, like already part of what I could answer now. But I think it was Norbert Frey who used the term Sündenstolz or Sühnestolz, no? Like to be proud of one's own ability to atone. And I think it is a very German, bio-German way of dealing with one's history. But again, this is also, this is when we talk about our generation, I'm saying ours and looking to Frank, like those who were born in the 60s, maybe 50s, 60s, early 70s, who dealt with their own fathers and grandfathers. But by now we are dealing with kids who were born, surprisingly enough, in the 2000s and later. And so it's, a society which finally is aware of the fact that at least 1/3 has roots somewhere else. So this is changing, and it has to change. And I think, but it hasn't entered the debate or only on a theoretical level, because if you look at German historical departments, they are basically white. I mean, this is, and if I'm in advisory boards and if I'm in selection committees, the people we are able to select for a job at university, it's very homogeneous, and it's not only white, it's middle class. And I just want to make a very short remark. It's not the solution for everything, but the German education system from grade 0 is extremely segregationist and classicist. So I think it's one of the worst in the so-called industrialized world. So that once you come from a non-educated or whatever you want to call it family, your chances to get to a university degree are very, very, very low. So if you will look at this from this macro perspective, it's really a long, long way until this, what we now call our, colored, bunte, whatever society, multicultural society will end up in the German history departments. And this has to do with the system of education and of course the university system, which is different from the US.
So if I could pick up on that question that you're sort of alluding to, Stefanie, when you talk about the makeup of historians in German history departments. One of the striking things about this debate is who actually participated, right? And so you make a really, I think, important point about needing to separate the feuilleton debate from the historians' debate. But across those two kind of spaces of conversation, there are very specific people that are actually getting their voices heard, right? Who are actually getting published and sort of authorized to speak. Do one of the other panelists or Stefanie, do you have thoughts about this? Robert and Esra?
Who's coming first? I just wanted to add. I completely agree with Stefanie Schüler-Springorum on the homogeneity of German history departments, and that's also very visible in the debate. And it's not just the German history departments; it's also journalism in Germany. But history doesn't only happen in history departments, and that's an interesting absence in the debate. Is no one has asked actual practitioners of history and memory how they deal with this problem, with which they are have been confronted for a few years now. Namely, if you if you do education programs in one of the Gedenkstätten of the ex-concentration camps, you have been confronted with mixed school classes for years and years now. And they have developed pedagogical concepts on how to deal with that, and they have their experiences, and they've never been asked about it. I talked to a colleague of mine in Trier who was working in a Gedenkstätte nearby, which is one of the lesser known concentration camps, but still was quite important. And by the way, had a lot of Black African-American prisoners of war. She talked a lot about this, that she's been confronted with young students whose family background is not German, and has talked to them about how to integrate these histories into their own understanding of Germany and their own identity and so on and so on. And there's really interesting stuff happening there. And the other thing is that a lot of the things that we think on the national level seem to be over and seem to be cleared up since the 2000s are still ongoing on a local level. For example, if you look at the Stolperstein-Initiativen, which have met with a lot of resistance locally, where a lot of families are still trying to block any kind of discussion about how their parents and grandparents came to own a shop in the center of town or so, you know. How certain parents and grandparents who had politically influential positions during the 1933 to 1945, how they behaved during that time, and so on and so on. And these are far from over on a local level, because there are still a lot of people alive who either they or their parents or grandparents were involved, and they still try to kind of block this and say, no, this is over, we don't need to talk about this anymore, and so on. So I think we are in an interesting situation in that some things seem to be cleared up in academic history, in the debates on a national level, but are still ongoing in everyday lives of people everywhere in Germany.
So, I mean, that's a very interesting observation that you make about the practitioners of memory culture, if you will, the people who are in the museums or at these memorial sites would have a very different perspective on some of these questions. Ezra, I imagine you have something to weigh in here on as well.
Yeah, I also was going to say, you know, Stefanie is totally right that, you know, that like who can officially talk and shape the discourse, they're all white, middle class, mostly men. But in Germany, everyone talks and everyone thinks about history, right? Everyone thinks about the Holocaust, and who thinks, or maybe the people I spend time with, immigrants think a lot about the Holocaust. Immigrants do think a lot about what happened in the past, you know, Muslim background, Turkish, Kurdish, Arab, Iranian background, newer, you know, refugees who have arrived, do think a lot about the Holocaust. How many organizations I attended, they're organized by, you know, Turkish workers union, or a Turkish high school teacher somewhere, a youth club in Duisburg, you know, so they engage with it, they think about it. But I think two things happen. One, they are heavily policed, let's say, how they engage with it. You know, they always feel like the teacher's eyes are on them. You know, oh, did you cry when you read Anne Frank? Or you didn't, you know, when we, you know, why is it that others showed all these emotions, you didn't? You know, so there is always this accusation that you're an anti-Semite, you're not empathizing enough. But, you know, we cannot expect that they will have the same emotions. You know, when you walk into a camp, if your grandfather was a Nazi versus, you know, you arrived to Germany as a refugee from a war zone, you will of course have different feelings when you go through these spaces. So that is one thing that is happening. And another thing is that, you know, sometimes there are no resources if you want to talk about contemporary racism. You talked about practitioners. There are a lot of practitioners in Germany because there is so much money available to talk about the Holocaust, to talk about past racism, but there is not as much money to talk about present racism. So sometimes people enter into talking about the Holocaust to bring up the discussion of the present racism. But sometimes they are told, no, see, you're an anti-Semite, but some of them do find a creative way.
Thank you, Esra. Frank, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a historian of fear, so I'm inclined to see anxiety everywhere. But I do think that part of the debate is also this anxiety about losing control. You know, who is entitled to participate in these debates? And sometimes this then also, you know, comes together with this German-American dimension. So as it has been said, you know, this kind of, at least in the academic sphere, this part of German history has been controlled by, you know, a fairly small group of mostly senior white academic men. And now there are other voices in the debate from abroad, from within German society, you know, using not just the traditional venues to articulate their views, but also social media, blogs. So all of this seems to be kind of running out of control. And I have this is my own experience too, that there's always this discourse in Germany about problematic developments in American academia that are sort of threatening to, you know, infect Germany. In the 1990s, it was Foucault and post-structuralism. And, you know, there was this almost pride that German historians especially could keep this at bay. Today, it's multiculturalism, diversity, and post colonialism. But you know, I also agree with Stefanie that I feel some of these issues are being debated with very little knowledge and a sort of dismissive attitude. Also, then that, you know, of course, scholars from abroad don't know the German debate well enough. They don't have access to the sources. Well, that never seemed to be a problem for people like, you know, Christopher Browning or Saul Friedlander, but it now becomes a problem for new participants in the debate. And, you know, again, I also agree with Stefanie that the way out of this really are these key terms, empathy and knowledge. I like this very much. And I actually do think that, you know, if there are two sides, they would actually have to learn a lot from each other. And it's also important for, you know, post-colonial scholars to engage with Holocaust historiography. I think this would actually be really fruitful, but of course, it also needs to work the other way. So, yeah, this I found so striking that somehow there seems to be this reluctance just to engage in an open-ended debate and to let yourself be influenced by alternative theoretical positions and alternative viewpoints.
Thanks, Frank. That's really helpful. Akasemi?
Yes, so clearly there's so much to talk about. I do want to try and incorporate some of the questions from our audience members and to encourage those of you who have something on your minds to post it in the Q&A. So I would love to hear views that are a bit more specific about what memories we're talking about in German memory culture. So Robert, you alluded to the fact that at the national level, it may seem like debates are closed, but there are at the local level still ongoing relationships in the terms of Germans who are alive now, whose fathers and grandfathers were Nazis. And then Esra, you alluded to as well recent refugees and the ways in which they are engaging with kind of an official German memory culture. But your comment also made me think, example of the firebombing incidents that happened in the 90s of refugee and asylum seeker housing buildings, and ways in which these may or may not be incorporated into German memory culture. So to hear what memories we're talking about when we're talking about German memory culture, and then what work is it that we expect memory culture to do? And I bring this up because one of the audience members has a concern about the issue of de-radicalizing young people who find Nazi ideology appealing, especially when it comes to them in the internet in the form of alt-right views, of dark humor. How do you see the memories that are included in German memory culture, and what work is it supposed to do? So Esra, I don't know if you want to start off.
Yeah, if I can jump in. I don't exactly know how de-radicalization will work. Probably it is like a multi-layered, multifaceted project. But I was going to, Akasemi, you introduced this idea there are layers and layers of history, even if we think through racism, right? It is not only anti-Semitism, there are also other sorts of lots of racist histories that we have in Germany. So if we even say this coming to terms with memory is coming to terms with racism, violence, the most brutal sides of humans, is it only the things that happened in Germany? So now if a third of Germans have come from elsewhere, aren't their memories are also now part of Germany? Didn't, people who came from Afghanistan bring those memories? People who came from Turkey that, many people came as political refugees in 1980s. Didn't they bring their histories of Turkish military junta, fascism? People who escaped the as the Iranian Revolution turned against leftists, didn't they bring those stories? Aren't they all part of the same history? I mean, of course, I know, and Germans should feel like, okay, Holocaust shouldn't be just blended into everything. I totally respect that, but also, as a non-German who really cares to learn from the Holocaust, how can we keep these separate? And aren't they also part of German history? And maybe that kind of a perspective, would that be an antidote to Nazism?
These are very open and important questions, certainly, when it comes to which memories and the memories of people from Afghanistan and from Turkey. And I would only add to that as well, what about the colonial experiences that Germans had in Tanzania or in Cameroon and that came back to continental Europe as it is? Are those memories included as well? And of former colonial subjects as well that came, are those included? But Stefanie, I saw your hand was up.
Yes, but that was to another topic. Maybe Robert wants to go first for the colonial memory, and then I will say something different.
I can say something about the colonial memory, but I'm also wondering, what do we do with conflicting memories? I remember at my old university, especially also in the migrant communities, I remember in my old university, we had a huge conflict when a Turkish PhD student who was working on, she was a political science student, and she was working on Turkish newspapers in the treatment of the Armenian genocide. And she was or her project was publicized in the Turkish newspaper Hurriyet, together with her professor, as you know, somebody who is against, who is, purporting lies about the Armenian genocide, and this is against Turkish national memory, and so on and so on. And she was, in the end, she was basically blocked from entering Turkey because she had to fear that she would be jailed, basically. And that happened. It was Turkish students at our university who had done this, who had publicized her project. So how do you deal with this? I have a lot of friends, Iranian friends, Turkish friends who are communists, left on the left, anti-fascists. Some of them have these victim histories that you talked about, and they have a lot of conflicts inside the communities themselves, basically. And that also comes into play when we talk about the European dimension of the Holocaust. How do you deal with the Polish government actually suing colleagues, our colleagues, historians, who are researching Polish collaboration and so on? I think that's a difficult question that comes as a next question after the question of integrating these memories. And the other thing is that, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, if I can quickly jump in, if we are talking about debates about memory in Germany, why would you expect that minorities in Germany have a unified view about that? Why would that be more difficult than Germans having conflicting memories?
That's what I mean. So how do you integrate? If you're talking about integration, how do you integrate conflicting memories?
I guess by nature they are, so sorry, but I'm just picking up this thing, having done research in Germany, that there is more is expected from the immigrants, and then they need to be a certain way to be integrated. Whereas in Germany, there are people who think, there has not been a legitimate German government since 1913, right? They're all the same. They're not different from white Germans. So maybe they're well integrated. But I mean,
the same goes for, how do you deal with, as the ones you mentioned, the Reichsbürger, basically, or Holocaust deniers, and so on. I mean, there are still huge debates in Germany and elsewhere if this idea that Holocaust denial is actually a crime in Germany, if that's okay in terms of free speech. So there's still, my point is, the integration becomes the integration of all these different memories, German or otherwise, becomes difficult. But also, I think if you look at what happened in the 1990s and the Geschichtswerkstätten movement and so on, there are now Geschichtswerkstätten who are not concerned with the memory of the Holocaust, but concerned with the memory of the pogroms of the early 90s, for example. And that's something that happens on the fringes of German discourse. And I think that's something that would be also important to integrate in a much more, in a much bigger way. There are projects that collect the witness statements, basically oral histories of the pogroms, of the people who survived, the people who lost families, and so on. And that's something that has not been picked up by academic history a lot, and it hasn't been picked up by official state memorialization a lot. So there's a lot of work to be done in integrating different memories. I just think that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard, and it's going to be difficult, and it's going to be very conflictual. And I'm just wondering, how do we prepare for these, or how do we deal with these conflicts? How do we manage them, basically? in terms of colonial memory, something that struck me, especially in the Mbembe debate in the last year, was that there were very, very few contributions to the debate who mentioned that Achille Mbembe comes from Cameroon, from an ex-German colony, and that as someone with that background, he might have a different view of German history than Germans, and that's really fascinating to me. There's this kind of Verdrängung. How do you call it in English? And it's also something that I find is something that lacks in the current debate, is the way that Namibian society and Namibian societies like Herero, Nama, and so on deal with the memory of the genocide. One of the things that I found irritating was that while the debate around the relationship between colonial violence and the Holocaust was going on in Germany, a book was published by the University of Windhoek from a Herero ex-SWAPO activist who was active in the nationalist movement, who had collected the statements and stories and memories of his grandmother, who as a small child had survived the genocide. And the book was published in Windhoek. It was debated in the press in Namibia. It was picked up by some academics outside of Namibia at SOAS, in the Review of African Political Economy, and so on. It was not present in Germany. I tried to get it in Germany. It wasn't. I didn't even find it on Amazon or other more specialist websites. It was really difficult to get the book. And so there's this complete absence of how Africans from the colonies, and I mean that's my expertise. I'm sure that's very much true of other colonies, of other German colonies in China or in the South Sea, in the Pacific, and so on. The complete absence of how academics in Namibia, how the survivors, how the local historians deal with these things, and the research is there. I mean, some of it you can get free on the internet because it's published as a PhD thesis, and it's open access on university repositories. It's not difficult to find it if you know where to look.
Stefanie, I know you've been wanting to weigh in.
Yeah, now I'm flipping back to the memory culture and the initial question, what job does it do, and what can it do in prevention work? So I just want to make two remarks. One is, and this is taking up Habermas, whose intervention I also really cherished, I must say, especially since he is talking not only with his name, but with his 90-something years, to say, yes, memory culture is always a function of present day needs, as we all know, and so it will change. I mean, who, if not historians, should know that this will be subject to change? We don't commemorate the 30 Years' War and its victims today, like maybe they did in 1700 something. And maybe in 20 years, people will watch the video of this discussion and smile a little bit at our strange discussion. And in 100 years, they will not even understand what it's all about. So I think this is, and so I do think that our memory culture will change. It will take time, but it is changing already. With this kind of debate is already part of the change. And of course there will be conflicts, but there has always been conflict from 1945 onwards. So this is not new. This is part of I mean, this is a good thing. I mean, I prefer a conflict and a debate, like if it's within certain parameters, to what we call the monolithical, politically instrumentalized memory culture that is at stake now. That's one thing. But on the other hand, where I really I'm more pessimistic than Esra, is that memory culture will serve as a kind of prevention, and that was also the question from the Q&A, to radicalism and right-wing extremism or murder and so on and so forth. I think memory culture is about commemoration and knowledge. And we are talking here, first of all, I mean, this is very old-fashioned, but about social issues. So this is also something for social workers. This has to do with economy. This has to do with many issues and with racism, of course. But it's not by memory culture from above that we will, prevent right-wing terrorism. And the first people to prevent right-wing terrorists should be the police and the secret services. I mean, but seriously, I mean, this is something, to put it differently, people should know that you don't kill or hurt other people even without knowing anything about history. This should be, part of a human right or whatever about it, education and certain values. And I don't think that history really helps, or at least it's not the most helpful thing. It can help, but it's not the solution. I'm very much convinced of this.
And I think, Frank, you had raised your hand earlier to also jump in.
Yeah, maybe just briefly on this question of competing and conflicting memories. So and maybe I just don't know this research, but I really do think we need more research on the interrelationship between the emergence of Holocaust memory and the emergence of a multicultural society in Germany. I've learned from Rita's book, actually, how in the 1980s, the time when Holocaust memory first emerged, how that went along with increasing anti-Turkish racism and restrictions to immigration. And I don't know, if there's a causal relationship or what the sort of temporal congruence actually implies. And this question could be then pushed forward to the 1990s and those racist pogroms and violence. And maybe this would also be a research question that has to be analyzed from both perspectives, so including the voices of Turkish immigrants, of asylum seekers, of Afro-Germans. So it's also about, I guess, diversifying the history of the Federal Republic with respect to this issue of Holocaust memory.
I think those are really interesting thoughts, Frank, and especially this question of, sort of going back to the earlier moment in our discussion of historicizing these debates, right, as part of a long line of competing opinions and positions on the past, right, and specifically around the Holocaust. In the case of Germany, how does colonialism come into that? Is it possible to compare those two kind of moments of kind of acute racial violence, right? That was sort of one of the starting questions for Michael and really for Dirk's work on comparative genocide. Some of the other comments, there have been a lot of comments and questions in the chat, and I think so many, right, Akasemi, that it's going to be hard in the next 10 minutes to get everything in. But people have raised other moments like the Goldhagen debate, other kinds of things that I think would need to be part of a kind of longer historical trajectory on this thematic or on this question. So I just wanted to do a little bit of a slight turn, because another line of questioning in the comments has been sort of thinking about these questions in relation to US debates, right? And especially in the last few years, there have been debates also on memory culture in the United States Civil War memorials, the absence of and resistance to basic knowledge of US history, and especially the history of slavery, links between slavery and current police violence against African Americans. Now, as Harold Marcuse in the audience has mentioned, there's all this kind of controversy around critical race theory, right? So do any of you have thoughts about how the kind of practice of memory culture around the Holocaust can be a model for the United States in its kind of memory work, right? And the kind of similarly in the United States, it's a long history of memory work that has also had many phases, but we're in a very particular moment now. Thoughts? Stephanie, Frank?
Yeah, I will just start with a very small thought, because I really don't dare to say anything about American historical debates and so on, even though I follow them, but I really wouldn't want to say anything about it. But what I want to say is that we must not underestimate the fact that German memorial culture came about or started with Germany losing a war, being defeated, and being occupied by 4 allied forces, which each of them in their own way dealt with this past. But basically, the first thing all of the 4 allies did was to declare the former regime a criminal regime, and what they did, murder and illegal. And so this was setting the tone from the very beginning, something that, for example, did not happen in Spain and did not happen in the US, or not in the same way, starting with, the occupation. So I think this is what really makes the German case so special, because this explains a lot. And Sebastian Conrad's thesis is that the memorial culture one, as he calls it, starts already in the 80s and has to do with European integration. I would say it starts, if at all, in the 90s and has to do with unification and with becoming salonfähig, like able to enter the world as an autonomous and not occupied state and after unification. So I think this factors, which are outside factors, play a huge role that we forget when we start to compare different countries.
Yeah, I think that's true. I just would like to add one fact to this, which complicates this history of occupation, namely the fact that the American army that occupied Germany was a segregated army, right? Which is a fact that you surprisingly do not find in many German histories of the occupation, and points out the complexity of this relationship. And in my German history courses, I always tell my American students, and in some ways maybe I do exhibit some pride in German commemorative culture, because I tell them, the Holocaust memorial in the center of the German capital, the equivalent to this would be a memorial to the genocide of Native Americans or to slavery right next to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And there are good reasons why such a memorial does not yet exist. But at the same time, I also think that it doesn't just work in one way, so that Americans can learn from Germans. Maybe Germans can also learn from the American debates. And in the questions we got before this event, someone raised this issue of the 1619 project, or Ta-Nehisi Coates' blistering indictment of racism in the United States. And I was sort of thinking, how would the German equivalent of this look like? What would a 1690 equivalent to a 1619 project in Germany look like? And who would be the German Ta-Nehisi Coates who would formulate a similar kind of critique of German society? Thank you.
Semi, are you?
Yes, I just wanted to leave the floor open in case Esra or Robert, either of you want to respond to that question of Rita's.
I mean, that is a a genre, right? We have a lot of it out there, you know, what Germany has to teach to the world. On the one hand, of course, right, you know, compared to, you know, we don't have almost any other example as Germany, you know, it is fascinated. I'm one of the people who, you know, came to Germany to study this out of the fascination. But at the same time, you know, this, as Stefanie was saying, what is this, you know, being proud of your ability to, you know, so that also, like the pride that came out of it. And then the idea that Germany will now educate the rest of the world. There are tons of projects like that, right? You know, they went to places to educate. I think, you know, I would say in Turkey, this interaction, like having not the Germans coming telling to Turks what to say, but a lot of the, you know, Turkish intellectuals who came to Germany brought a lot of really interesting discussions to Turkey that helped talk about the Armenian genocide, which has been helpful. But what is not helpful that I observe is that when this Germany turns towards the internal minorities, that it is this internal civilizing project that we have learned. Now it is done, we're over with it. And now our concentration camps are empty, so we'll have the refugees go through it. Or, you know, now most of the money will be devoted to minorities. So that, yeah, you know, that is the difficult part, when Germans feel like we accomplished it, we did it, we reached there now, and will now teach it to others. That is the part when it starts to get problematic.
Frank, did you want to comment quickly on Esra's?
Quickly, I just wanted to point out that this kind of argument is the classical colonial not yet argument, right? We have accomplished it, but we have to teach the rest of the world to catch up to our level. And that's kind of ironic, I think.
Robert, do you want to respond?
Yes, I just wanted to emphasize again that I think the problem is if Germany tells itself that it's over, is its own problem already, even before the next step that, you know, now we can teach the rest of the world. So the question for me would maybe be, how much can Germany learn from itself in terms of how we deal now with the memory of colonialism, of German colonialism? How can we learn? How can everybody who's involved right now in the negotiations between the German state and the Namibian state, which actually should be negotiations between the German state and community representatives of the victimized communities. How can they learn from the processes of restitution and Wiedergutmachung that have been done after 1945 in terms of the Holocaust? And that seems something to me that's not on the table at the moment, and there's a refusal. And at the same time, as I say, you know, on several levels in Germany itself, the question of how do we remember the Holocaust itself is still not finished. And I remember as a student that a lot of the times that academics from the UK or the US, people who studied German history, came to Germany, they would say that they would be very positive towards the German process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and they would often mention it as a model for the UK and the US. And most German academics were very skeptical of that and said, you know, we are actually really critical of the way that this is being done in Germany, and we don't think it's a model. And I wonder when that changed. And I think that's actually what we as Frank and others have mentioned before. I think that's something that we need to study now as a kind of contemporary history.
Well, on that note, I have to close our event. I want to thank my colleague Rita for co-moderating with me. I want to thank each of our distinguished panelists for very engaging discussion. I want to thank the German Historical Institute, Simone Lässig, my colleague Heike behind the screens, for helping us to organize this event. I would also like to thank the American Historical Association, the Historikerverband in Germany, with Lutz Raphael, and my colleague Isabel Richter, DAAD Professor of German and History here at Berkeley, for all their input in this event. This discussion will have to continue at another time, and many thanks, of course, to all of you in the audience for joining us. Bye-bye.